And we're standing at what is the holiest site of Judaism, the Western Wall, where once stood the two temples. The entire past of the Jewish people centers around this site, but its primary meaning is the future of the Jewish people and the world. For from Zion shall come forth Torah, and the word of God from Jerusalem. Our vision is that the state of Israel shall be the place from which, in its time, redemption shall come to all mankind as man returns to himself and God from this site where it is most easy to do so. There is one thing I notice which is lacking at the wall, and that is information. And the project I have described to you basically is our information booth for the wall for the many, many Jews and non-Jews who all converge on this site, which is called the navel of the world in the Talmud, to learn about God's revelation to man through the Jewish people. Vision was beautifully expressed. The mission of the Jewish people is shown in murals on the life of Yaakov, Jacob.
We're very happy to welcome all of you here tonight to join with us in a commemoration of the Holocaust and the Holocaust victims. Of course, there is no commemoration without an attempt to understand. There is no commemoration without knowledge. And we feel very honored that we have tonight with us Rabbi Riskin to try and shed some light in this great darkness. Thank you very much.
First, that I stand here with feelings of great, not only humility, it's a wrong word, inadequacy. And I first would ask Slicha Mechila from anyone who may be in the audience this evening who lived through the Holocaust. And if anything that I say is not acceptable to you, I bow before you. I also remember hearing from my Rabbi, Rav Soloveitchik Shlita, a recounting of a story that he heard. That there was a Rebbe and his 5 Talmidim. They were partisanim. They lived from true barks in the forest. They were caught and they were taken to the death camp in Treblinka. And when they arrived, each student knew by heart one of the 5 books of Chamisha Chumshei Torah. The Rebbe was afraid that there were no Jews left. He was alone in the forest with his 5 students. He was about Korah, and he knew the Chumash by heart. And he taught each of his students another one of the books of the Bible, hoping that in this way Judaism would be able to maintain itself and continue beyond the destruction of all the Jews. And when he arrived in the death camp of Treblinka, he met a friend of his who had been a dayan, a judge and a great posek. And when the dayan saw this Melamed Daratike, this Rebbe of young students, and the 5 boys, each of whom had learned one of the 5 books of Moses, the dayan fell to the floor and cried out, Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, I would gladly give up my life this minute if only I could die with that same faith and surety that Melamed Daratike has. Faith is not simple. Nachman of Bratslav said, it requires tremendous sophistication to acquire simple faith. And it is correctly been taught for those who believe there are ultimately no questions. And for those who are skeptics, there are ultimately no answers. Nevertheless, with fear and trembling, I want to attempt to give to you one individual's view of the concept of faith post-Holocaust. What does the Torah say? What does the Torah promise? What does the Torah guarantee? And here, I believe it's critical that we take this book seriously. Because if indeed we begin by taking Torah seriously, I think we'll find that the one leitmotif throughout Chumshei Torah, I never promised you a rose garden. I think that the most fundamental aspect of biblical prophecy is es ist schwer zu sein. Remember that picture in Tevye? Shalom Aleichen's great masterpiece, Tevye the Milchige, Fiddler on a Roof. When the Jews are told they have to leave on a tefka, and Tevye goes off to a corner. We have to leave. We have to move. God, chosen people. This is what it means to be chosen. Again, pogroms. Again, exile. Again, banishment. Listen, God. When you're choosing next time, do me a favor and choose somebody else. Tevye, in a very folk fashion, is expressing a fundamental truth of what the chosen people is all about. To be a Jew means to carry the burdens of the world. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi talks about it in the Kuzari. The Navi Yeshayahu in Perek Nun Gimel speaks of it. To be a Jew means to be the conscience of the world. And therefore to be a Jew means that we will have to suffer. There's only one promise in the Torah. That promise is seen in Sefer Bereshit, Perek Tetvav, when God enters into a brit, a covenant with Avraham Avinu, and when God explains to Avraham Avinu according to the Ramban. Remember chapter 15 of the book of Genesis. Bereshit Perek Tetvav, there's a great battle, the 4 kings against the 5 kings. Avraham Avinu joins in the battle. Avraham Avinu is responsible almost single-handedly for the victory against 4 kings who had completely paralyzed the Mesopotamian region. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avraham Avinu, Al tira Avraham scharcha harbei me'od, don't be afraid, your reward will be exceedingly great. And Avraham Avinu says, what kind of reward are you going to give me? Behold, I'm walking childless, I have no child, I have no heir. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, look up at the stars, can you count them? Just as you can't count the stars, so will your descendants be innumerable, you will have a child. Abraham believed in God and it was accounted to him as an act of great righteousness. The very next pasuk, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, and your descendants, your children and your children's children, they will inhabit this land, the land of Israel. And Avraham Avinu looks up and says, Hashem Elokim, Bamo Eidaki Irashena, how do I know that they will inherit it? And all of the commentaries ask the question, Abraham was such a great believer, he was a man of such profound faith. Abraham is in his 90s and Sarah is in her 80s and Sarah has ceased menstruating, and just one verse before, God promises Abraham a son. And biologically, I don't have to tell you, that's impossible. Then Amin Bashem. And Abraham believed that that would happen. Then God says the next thing, your children and grandchildren will inherit the land of Israel. All of a sudden, Abraham becomes a skeptic and says, how do I know that they will inherit it? Plenty of hills to live on. Come out to a flat. Another million Jews, we have plenty of room for you. And I promise you, it's much, much better than any place you come from outside of Israel. Much better than New York, and much better than California, and much better than Phoenix, Arizona. I'll tell you the secret, it's even better than Borough Park. I don't know any source that says that Mashiach is coming from Borough Park. Not for Muncie either. And not from 770 either. From Eretz Yisrael. Dafka from Eretz Yisrael. So why was it so hard for Abraham to accept the fact that the Jews would inherit the land of Israel? Well, one simple answer that the traditional commentaries didn't know was how difficult it is for Jews to make Aliyah. Maybe Abraham understood that. That's why he said that a 95-year-old woman will give birth. That's possible. That Jews from Borough Park will come to Israel. That's impossible. Then my grandmother used to say, Malach mit Yachinkis. I imagine I'm talking to an audience, all of whom now lives in Israel. However, I can't tell you the change in this country if another million American Jews would come here to live. I can't tell you what it would do for Israel. I also can't tell you what it would do for those million Jews. But the Ramban provides the theological answer. The Ramban says that Abraham believed that he had a special relationship with God. But he understood that special relationship to be like a contract. In a contract, there are two sides. Party of the first part, party of the second part. If the party of the second part doesn't fulfill his obligations, the party of the first part doesn't have to fulfill his obligations. Abraham knew he had a special relationship. He had to be good, and if he were good, he would get a son, and God could do anything. So he was ready to believe that God would do it, and that he would be worthy of it. It wasn't such a difficult thing. If until age 90 plus, he was good enough in God's eyes, from age 90 plus on, you have to know how many sins can you do post 90? But when God tells Abraham, your descendants will have this land, about this Abraham has a legitimate question. How do I know that they will inherit it? How do I know that they'll be worthy of it? How do I know that they'll keep Torah and mitzvot? And here God says to Abraham, I want to tell you the deepest secret of Jewish history. My relationship with you is not merely that of a contract, but it's that of a covenant. And the difference between a contract and a covenant is that a contract can be broken. A covenant is irrevocable. I guarantee that there will always be a faithful remnant. I guarantee that there will always be a group of Jews worthy of return to Israel. I guarantee an eternal relationship between at least a group of Jews and the Torah and Eretz Israel. That's the covenant that That's the only promise. Now I want to read to you text. Because it's important to see what the Torah has to say. Devarim, Perek Dalet, Psukim Chaf Hei following, Deuteronomy chapter 4 verses 25 following, Moses' farewell speech to the Jewish people. And Moses says as follows. You'll have children, grandchildren, but Oshantem Ba'aretz, you spend a long time in the land of Israel. Vishchatem. You'll act perversely. Vasitem pesel tmunat kol, vasitem hara b'nei Hashem Elokecha lachiso. You make idols, you do evil in God's eyes to make Him angry. Haidoti b'chem hayom et hashamayim v'yadaretz. I bear testimony against you this day, the heavens and the earth. Ki avot toveidun maher. You'll be quickly destroyed from off this land. Can you understand? You'll keep Torah. That's your rent for living in Israel. You don't pay the rent, you get expelled from the house. But Moses continues his prophecy and his farewell speech. God will scatter you among the nations. You'll be very few in number among the peoples where God will scatter you there. And obviously, if you didn't keep Torah when you lived in your own country, you will most certainly assimilate in the countries of the exile and the diaspora. You'll serve their gods created by human beings, eitz va'eben, sticks and stones. The Vilna Gaon says, eitz, the Christian cross, even, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. However, וביקשת משם את השם אלוקיך ומצאת. In the midst of that exile, in the midst of your being a small people amongst great host nations, you will nevertheless search for the Lord your God, and you will find Him, because you will have searched for Him with all your heart and with all your soul. Has anybody here been to Russia? Anybody? Well, I tell you, whoever can go should go. You won't help the Russians necessarily, not even the Russian Jews, but it will change your lives. In the 1950s, Elie Wiesel wrote a book called The Jews of Silence. And he said the Russian Jews were the Jews of silence. We have to be their voice. I visited the Soviet Union in 1970, and I began to see a tremendous movement. And I saw Jews. One particular Jew, Len Yurigerman, whose father was a communist who lived in Allerton Avenue in the Bronx, who made Aliyah. His father was a communist who believed in communism much more than most Jews believe in Judaism, because his father made Aliyah to Russia in 1932. And in the midst of that background, Len Yurigerman decided one day, for no apparent reason, that he was in a strange land. He was a stranger in a strange land, and he ran to the shul on Archipova Street. He had never been bar mitzvah. And he saw a line. And he said, "What's this?" And they told him, "We're getting matzah." "What's matzah?" "That special bread of freedom." And he took a matzah, and there was a camera. He was fired from his job, but he became a religious Jew. In the Soviet Union, there are hundreds of Jews whose parents were communists who now know how to to learn a black Gemara. There's a movement of tshuva in the Soviet Union that would put the American and Israeli Jewish community to shame. And the Torah precisely says that this will happen. I remember once I had a student in a seminar. He came from a Protestant school in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. And at night, when I used to say Kriyat Shema al Hanuta, he would listen to say the words after me. And the last day of the seminar, he became a completely observant Jew over 1 week. He said to me, you know, he said, my father is a Christian, but my mother's great-great-grandfather, they said, was a great rabbi. Did you ever hear his name? Akiba Eger. He's around today, this young fellow, with a Christian father. Rabbi Akiba Eger Zainikel. Lebanon, Pennsylvania. How does this happen? Moshe Rabbeinu told you how it will happen. But Tzarlecha, when it'll be difficult for you, you'll be in the midst of your exile. Umetzarucha kol hadvarim ha'ele. This Torah and these words will find you. Why and how? Because the Lord your God is a God of love. He will neither forsake you nor destroy you. He will never forget the covenant with your fathers that he has sworn unto them. Oh, peace. It will be fought with difficulty. The same book of Devarim, Perek Chet, Parashat Ki Tavo. The Torah says as follows: "V'hayayim lo tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha." You won't serve the Lord your God. By the way, all liberal Jews don't like to read this because it's not pleasant. And we only like to talk about pleasant things, but this is not a pleasant night. Yom HaShoah is not a pleasant day, and Jewish history is not necessarily pleasant. And to be an adult means to face unpleasant things. And the Torah, which is a book of honesty above all else, sometimes speaks unpleasantries. And every Jew has to make a decision: do I take this book seriously or don't I take it seriously? So what will happen? Torah tells you what will happen. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed will be your basket and your trough. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. And what will pursue you? Shachvet, kadachat, daleket, charchur, cherev, shidafon, yarkon. The most horrible and unimaginable diseases and plagues, ad otecha, until you will be destroyed. The heavens above your head will turn to brass. And the earth under your feet will be iron. ייתן השם את מטר ארצך אבק, ועפר מן השמיים ירד עליך. God will cause the rain of your lands to be dust powder. And the dust of the earth will fall upon you. And you'll be smitten with shigaon, with madness, and ibaron, and blindness, and timhon levav, and the confusion of the heart. And your carcasses will become food for the animals and for the fowl. And no one will be afraid to consume you. And you will grope about in the afternoon, just like a blind person gropes about in the darkness. I want to ask you a question. Does it matter if a blind person is groping in light or groping in darkness? What's the difference? You know what the commentaries say? There is a difference. When a blind person gropes at night, nobody sees him to help him. You grope like a blind person gropes in darkness. You'll be destroyed and no one will come to help you. What are these psukim called? You know what are they called? The Torah. You know what the custom is? You don't read them in a loud voice. The Balkora reads them in a whisper. And I remember in my shul in Lincoln Square, nobody wanted an aliyah, this aliyah. And there were all sorts of patenting. Now, unfortunately, fortunately, I'm Kohen. But therefore, unfortunately, I could never take this aliyah. The first year that I was there, I gave a clap up in Tish, and I said, the Gabbai gets that aliyah. Like it, or stop being Gabbai. Nobody stopped being Gabbai because of this aliyah. But nobody likes the aliyah. I want to tell you a true story. I know exactly what had happened. I was 12 and a half years old. My parents bought me my first suit. Lower East Side, Elizabeth Street. Anybody remember the store there? Right next door there was a tailor named Garvin. Navy blue suit. Tailored. I remember because I told my mother I wanted to wear it a few weeks before my bar mitzvah. Why? Because the Klausenberger Rebbe came to Brooklyn. And he took over the Beth Moses Hospital. And I was very anxious to daven with the Hasidim. I had never seen a Hasidic daven. I was a little kid and I didn't want to go without a suit. I didn't realize I could have been Michael the suit, I just needed a hat. And I would have bought me a hat. Anyway, I went with the suit. And I was very impressed by the tenor of the davening and the itlavut. But what I really remember is the Balkori was Parshat Kitavo. And the Balkori was reading the Torah. And the Klausenberger Rebbe who lost 12 children in the Holocaust, who didn't sit Shiva, because he said, I have to save my Hasidim. There's no time to sit Shiva. He wasn't the Rebbe who got out first. He got out among the last. That's why he has so many zchuyot. He came to Brooklyn and he announced he was on the way to Eretz Yisrael, and he stayed in the Beth Moses Hospital. He turned it into a large synagogue and yeshiva with a trade school. Satmar threw stones in the windows because he was a Zionist Rebbe. He moved to Eretz Yisrael. He established Kiryat Zan, Stanyado Hospital. He has many, many zchuyot. He's living be well. I went to down in there. 1952. And he gave a clap in Tish. And he said, as the Balkori began to read the Torah on a whisper, he said, Echer, louder. There was a bit of a hush. Well, it's not like a rabbi, it's a Rebbe. A rabbi talks, so the rabbi thinks, but to see what the rabbi thinks, and see what the president thinks, and see what everybody thinks. Everything's more important than what the rabbi thinks. But a Rebbe is different. And he said, Hefe. And nobody quite understood. And they weren't quite sure they heard right. And the Balkori continued to read in a whisper, and the Rebbe gave another bang on the table, and he said, Ich hab gesagt, Hefe. And the Balkori looked quizzically at the Rebbe. After all, Minik Yisrael Dinu, a custom is like a law. The Rebbe said, Lezim Hand Bashefa. Let the Creator hear loud all the curses. We have nothing to be afraid of. They've already happened to us. And if he hears, then we'll know it's time for the blessings. And in a loud, strong voice, the Balkori read, Parashat Ki Tavo, the Torah. And what are the blessings? The blessings you'll find in Devarim Perek Lamed. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 10. After all these things have happened to you, all the curses, all the difficulties, all the problems, all the madness, all the destruction, the fact that parents ate children and carcasses were left for food for beasts of the field and fowls of the heavens. And then you'll begin to think again in your hearts among all the nations that you were scattered there. You'll begin to realize that there's no ultimate hope for Jews in the diaspora. You'll begin to realize that you can't stay under a foreign government forever. And you'll return to the Lord your God. And you listen to his voice. And God will restore your remnant. He'll have compassion. He will return to you. And he'll gather you from all the nations where he has scattered you there. Even if you're scattered to the ends of the heavens, even if you're in South Africa, even if you're in Ethiopia. Misham yikabetz Hashem Elokecha, Misham yikachecha. From there will God gather you, and from there will He take you up. Ve'viyacha Hashem Elokecha el haaretz asher yarshu avotecha v'irishta. And the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers have inherited, and you will inherit it. Ve'tivcha, He'll do well by you. Ve'yirbacha mi'avotecha, and you'll be more numerous than your fathers. You all read about the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea on Shvi Shel Pesach, and you were impressed? This is far more impressive. This is a far greater miracle. We, in our generation, have the merit to witness this, and we don't realize it. We don't accept it. We don't believe it. Believe me, we don't believe it. We believe that there will be no Jew left in Borough Park or in Muncie. But nevertheless, it's a great miracle. What am I telling you? The first thing I'm telling you is that the Holocaust is part of the Torah. Not pleasant, not nice. It's part of the Torah. The second thing I'm telling you is that that same Torah that's 4,500 years old is a far better prophesier than the Chozai, the weather report man, on radio and television. The weather report man is wrong at least 50% of the time. Unless he says Munan Chalkit, he has nothing to lose. The Torah is right on the button. Just look around you. I want to say much more. And I'll ask your indulgence for another 15 minutes, and I want you to hear me very well. You're asking the wrong question. The question is really not, can I believe in God after Auschwitz? And I'll tell you why that's not the question. God did not bring about Auschwitz. Don't blame him. Don't blame God for what human beings did. Don't blame God for what Hitler did. Don't blame God for what all of Europe conspired with Hitler to do. Don't blame God for what Roosevelt did. Roosevelt, who my grandmother called Rosenfeld, she was sure that he was a Jew. She didn't know that he didn't even allow the allowable quota of Jews into America. The hypocrisy that America dares speak to us post-Holocaust about friendship and the fact that we can't spy. I'll tell you something. I'm a very proud American citizen. I'm an Israeli citizen and an American citizen, and I carry both passports with pride. In my house in Efrat, on Thanksgiving, we have a turkey dinner with cranberry sauce. One of the reasons I wear a tie is because I want my children to know that I come from America and I'm not at all ashamed of it. I'm very proud of it. America gave me a great deal, and Baruch Hashem is still giving me a great deal. You're all invited to visit Efrat. I may not be there when you come, but Efrat will be there. And you'll see religious institutions. We have a yeshiva now, a yeshiva network, from elementary school to rabbinical school, of 1,200 students in less than 4 years. It's a miracle, because Israel is a miracle country. Thanks to God, number one, the miracle of Israel, number two, and my friends mostly from America, and a number of very good friends from England, who are kind enough to have helped and to have realized that we're doing something significant. So I'm very grateful to America. Yet at the same time, I don't have double loyalty, I have only one loyalty, and that's my Jewish loyalty. The founder of Christianity is the one who said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. If someone is an American citizen and spies, he has to be punished. That's one thing. The punishment fit the crime. I think the punishment was far more severe than was deserved. I also think that it goes against the basic principles of American freedom for Caspar Weinberger to have told the judge what kind of sentence to give. And I think someone who is a spy has to understand if he's caught, he will have to pay a certain punishment. But that the Mayofisnik American Jewish leaders didn't speak out in one voice against the severity of the crime, against the severity of the punishment. And in America post-Holocaust, when the American government did not tell the Jewish community, and they knew darn well what was happening. And the fact is that even now, there was a tremendous amount of information that the American State Department had in terms of the Middle East that wasn't given to Israel. That America should righteously say, what need is there to take information? After all, we're friends. Post-Holocaust, we don't have to justify the fact that Israel has got to take care, first and foremost, of Israel's self-interest. But what should have been an American Jew, these are secondary questions that the leadership here should stand up and take responsibility for. I was going to make my point very clear. A spy, you take a chance, you have to take your punishment. I'm also not sure that Israel should have chosen an American Jew.
I agree on that.
And I think the sentence was far too severe. I think American Jewish leadership should have certainly stood up trying to help Poland, and I think it's hypocrisy of America to claim that we don't have the right to look after our own self-interest post-Holocaust. The fact that the President of the United States withheld from Jewish leadership the facts of what was happening in the death camps. And we know this now historically. Don't blame God for what Hitler did, for what Europe did, for what America did, for what Canada did, and for what innumerable Jews throughout the world did not do. You know what free choice means? I learned this when I was very, very young. I'll give you a kaviyachal example. I wanted to run for the presidency of Yeshiva University, Yeshiva College, student presidency, student body. A very good friend of mine, Benji Hirsch, was running. I wanted to run too, but I wanted to be a good guy too. So I figured I'd ask him if he would mind if I'd run. I was sure he would say he wouldn't mind. So I asked him. And he said, don't run. And I ran anyway. And that's why I probably lost. No, that's probably why I lost. But I learned a very important lesson. That when you ask somebody a question, when you give him the right to make his decision, then you have to be ready for the fact that he will will decide something that you don't want him to decide. Every parent knows that. We live through it as parents, don't we? We'll give our children freedom, and sometimes they'll do things that we don't want them to do. They may go into a profession we don't want them to go into. They may marry a person we don't want them to marry. They may live in a country we don't want them to live in. That's the price of freedom. Well, God created us with that price. That's what Tzelem Elokim is all about. God gives us free choice to make even those decisions that He is against. The Rambam speaks about this in great detail in Mordechai. Mishnah Avot, Hakol Tzafui, God sees everything, but He doesn't control everything. Harishut Netuna, freedom of choice is nevertheless bestowed. That's the great principle of Rabbi Akiva. So don't blame God. Who should we blame post-Holocaust? And what is the real question of faith post-Holocaust? And I want to tell you something. And I want you to listen to me well. You know, do you have still patience to listen a little bit? Yes? Okay, so listen to me. You know, when I was in New York, I was in the shidduch business. Baruch Hashem, in Israel, I'm out of the shidduch business because the shidduchim in the flat work very well. The average family has 6 children, Baruch Hashem. At least 5 children. Few with 9. In New York, those of you who know and remember, I had a kehillah with at least 300-400 singles every Shabbos. More often than not, I would get a call from a father wanting to know about this boy or this girl. That wouldn't bother me so much. In other words, the child was going out with someone, the father would begin the conversation like this. What can you tell me about X's parents? What can you tell me about Y's family? But I understand, I'm a father also, and I have children too, and I have, Baruch Hashem, a married daughter. A grandson. But I very much resented the question, especially since most of my children were Balei Tshuva, most of my kehillah were Balei Tshuva. And the parent who called didn't want to hear that, and they wanted a good religious family for their child. So invariably my response was this: if you want to know about the person, I can tell you. If you want to tell me about the person's parents, I really don't know anything about the person's parents. But one thing I can tell you blind. You're looking for yichus? More yichus than David HaMelech, more yichus than Mashiach Tzidkenu, this person has. For a very simple reason. Who will the Mashiach come from? Who did David HaMelech come from? First of all, never a Gioret, Ruth the Moabite. But that's not so bad. Who did Ruth come from? Ruth came from Lot, the result of an act of incest. Me'am, between a father and a daughter. Stellt sich vor als Eiches. Who was your great-grandfather? My great-grandfather was Episode who slept with his daughter and impregnated her, and the result of that relationship is a bride. Shena Machton. I want to sharpen the issue a little bit, so listen to me well. I want to sharpen it a little bit. Look at the difference between the Jewish Messiah and, I don't know what to say, Lahavdil isn't even sufficient, whom the Christians call the Messiah. The founder of Christianity was born from immaculate conception. Sein Tat ist auf Gott allein. Our Messiah comes from Azah Shenem Yichus, an act of incest. I'll tell you why I like ours much better. It's very simple. I thought about this a lot, and this is the first time that I think I'm saying what I'm going to say now. It seems to me that if someone who were born from immaculate conception would come into this world, a world where people push online, in a world where Jews don't want to come to Eretz Yisrael for no reason, and a world where people complain about nonsense things, and a world where every Monday and Tuesday the the coalition government is breaking, and it's making up, and it's breaking again, and there will be an international group to decide in Eretz Yisrael, and there won't be it. He takes one look at the nonsense that goes on in the world. He's not for this world. He'll never do a thing. He'll leave immediately. But the Messiah who comes from the background of a lot and an act of incest, and from Tatan's side, from Boaz's side, Yehuda and Tamar, an act of prostitution, such a Messiah may not be completely disillusioned by what he finds in this world, and is willing to work with us to make the situation better. It's much more human. And what I'm saying is very important because I think it's really a truth. Now listen to one more step. Really, why do we have a David HaMelech and a Mashiach Tzidkenu that comes from that kind of relationship? And I want to tell you what the Midrash says. The Midrash says that Lot's daughter, when she saw Sodom and Amorah completely destroyed, she was certain that this is the end of the world. She didn't think it was just Sodom and Amorah. Anyone who lived through the Holocaust, they saw what was going on in Europe, and that's the end of the Jewish people. That's the end of the world. And she went to the Zohar, and she's alone with her father, and she thinks that's it. There are no more people. There's her and her sister and her father. That's it. Now what would an ordinary person think? HaKadosh Baruch Hu tried with Adam and there were 10 generations and it didn't work. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tried again with Noah and there were 10 generations and it didn't work. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tried again with Avram and look what happened, Sodom and Amorah. Look how bad people are. What's the good of having children? What's the good of continuing the world? You'll only continue the misery. You'll only continue to destroy yourselves. That's logic. But Lot's daughter said no. I know that historically speaking and logically speaking, if we would start the world again with another child, there'll be another conflagration like Sodom and Amorah, and we'll probably get into the same morass of immorality. However, the Torah says that the human being is created in the divine image. God says there's a purpose to humanity, otherwise humanity would never have been created. I believe that despite everything that I see round about me, there's a future for the human race. There's a future for humanity. I want to have another child. And having that other child, in effect forcing her father to impregnate her, was a statement of profound faith in human nature. I know a woman who was a midwife. And you know what she used to do in Auschwitz? In Auschwitz, if you were pregnant, they killed you. But there were a few women who were so thin and so emaciated, they carried their babies and you couldn't tell that they were pregnant. And when there was time for them to give birth, this woman would help them give birth. And then you know what she had to do? She had to strangle and bury the child to which she gave life. Otherwise she would have been killed, the mother would have been killed, and maybe the whole barracks would have been killed. That woman is one of the Lamed Vavnikot. You know why? She came to Eretz Yisrael and she lives in Rehovot. She had 7 children and she now has grandchildren. What an act of faith. An act of faith in humanity and an act of faith in Jewish future. Do you know what Judaism really teaches at its core? Do you know what really requires a leap of faith? The question that you should ask is not where is God after Auschwitz. Read the Torah. The Torah tells you what will happen when it happened. You know what's really an act of faith? You know what the real question is after Auschwitz? Why have another child? Why go on with the Jewish people? Because don't kid yourselves. If one Holocaust happened, it would be much easier for another to happen. We even use the word glibly now. Everything is a Holocaust. Doesn't mean anything anymore. There's a Holocaustitis that's taking over the Jewish people. In the world at large, there's no business like Shoah business. And everything has become commercialized. And the word has lost its meaning. You know what the real question is post-Holocaust? How could I have another child? Why should I build a road? Why should I even try to continue Judaism or the human race? Because if the world could have stood silently by, there is no future for humanity. Judaism asks you to take a leap of faith not by believing in God. Judaism asks you to take a leap of faith by believing in human nature, by believing that ultimately we will do tshuva, by believing that ultimately we will perfect ourselves, by believing that ultimately there will be a redemption. That's what makes Judaism special. The Mashiach comes from Lot and his daughter because Mashiachiyut is based upon belief in Jewish future. I want to tell you something very personal. I'll tell it to you, I think you'll understand it. My sister has 6 children, Baruch Hashem. The eldest is 11. My parents, I'm sorry they're not here this evening. They're still with us, Baruch Hashem, and I hope they'll stay in Israel. Not this trip, but I hope very soon. My parents were wonderful, wonderful, and are wonderful parents. What makes them so wonderful, in addition to everything else, is not only the tremendous love that they had for all of us, and they have for all of us, but my mother is in a hell. She doesn't understand, or didn't understand. My parents grew up during the Depression. My father doesn't come from an observant family. My parents were hoping I would go to Harvard, I would be a successful lawyer, make a lot of money. Not for them, for me. I I wanted to be a rabbi, Rahman al-Islam. Orthodox rabbi, go to yeshiva. And although they disagreed, and this is a tremendous musar skill, although they disagreed, they supported me every inch of the way. When I got to Lincoln Center, I was very successful. In their eyes, certainly. And I was on radio, television, and all of a sudden, I moved to Israel. And my mother came the first time for my daughter's wedding, and the streets weren't paved. And she looked around, and it was very windy. And the sand got in her eyes, and empty mountains all around. And she looked at me with tears in her eyes, and she said, I don't understand. She said, you know, I left the little town, the little Dorfel of Lubin when I was 4 years old for the promised land for America. And you went back to Lubin? For Lincoln Center? She went to Lubin. She could. I understand her. I don't understand the Jews from Borough Park and Monsey who go to shul every Shabbos and don't come to Eretz Yisrael. I don't understand them. I understand my mother very well. And my mother grew up in an era where the perfect family was 2 children. And here my sister is, Baruch Hashem, with my brother-in-law building a house in a frat next door 2 hours, and they're coming an Aliyah soon as well. And my sister has 6 children, the oldest of whom is 11. And my mother is a trooper, and she comes every Thursday, and she helps my sister and brother-in-law, and she's really wonderful, but she scratches her head. We're all sitting at the table, and my mother came a week before my sister came to Eretz Yisrael this trip, and the phone rings in the middle of dinner. We were all having dinner together, and my brother-in-law comes out, and he says, my wife says that my mother is on the phone. My brother-in-law is on the phone. He would like to speak to my mother long distance from America. My mother takes the phone, and there's dead silence. And I got scared still. Thought that she heard that something very bad happened. And then she says, I guess I should say Mazel Tov. My sister was pregnant with child number 7, Baruch Hashem. So we were all thrilled. My mother quite didn't know how to react. I understand. Don't you see? I understand very well, but I want you to understand. And my mother's great, and I said she's a trooper, and then she called my sister, and she said my sister was nervous. How would my mother take it? But my sister and brother-in-law understand that every child is an act of faith. It's a mitzvah and it's a bracha. And there's no mitzvah and bracha as great as that is, and no act of faith as great as that is. The greatest act of faith imaginable. Faith in human nature and faith in Jewish future. That's the kind of act of faith that Judaism asks. And that's what makes Jews remarkable. Not that we believe in God after Auschwitz, that we have children after Auschwitz. That's what's remarkable. And I love when children come to shul, and I love when children make noise. Not when adults talk. Send them to the Young Israel. But when children make noise, I shouldn't say that. We're now a Young Israel in the frat, so I cross that from the record. Cross it from the record. Young Israels in America, in Israel, are qualitatively different. No talking in Israel. But children's noise is wonderful. Music to my ears. Because that's our faith and that's our future. Let me conclude with a very brief story. You've heard me talk a lot, you've heard me say this before, but that's okay. It's really germane. When I first came to a frat, I had Shmira. It was one of my first shmidot from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. God. I feel very good, by the way. I'm here for 3.5 years, and I got my notice that I have to appear before the draft board for a physical. I can hardly wait. My wife says that if Tzahal is waiting for me, she has to rethink our whole aliyah. I think I can hardly wait to take a picture in uniform. It's a great zchut. In the meantime, I just have guard duty with a gun. In the beginning, especially when people in Iraq didn't know each other. One fellow from one of the Scandinavian countries, a very fine fellow, good looking, came to our shiurim, spoke and speaks a flawless Hebrew. And we had Shmira together. And it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's dark, and it's quiet. And he says to me, well, he says, wow, Rabbi, what was it like before you came on Aliyah? And I described, being the rabbi in Lincoln Square. I loved it. I really loved it. I had wonderful, wonderful years. I tell him. And I said to him, well, what was your life like before you came on Aliyah? And he said, I was a Christian. I went to church with my parents and brother every Sunday morning. But something very strange. I always felt a very profound tie to the Jewish people. And in high school, when everyone had to write a paper on one of the burgeoning new third world countries, I wrote a paper on the state of Israel. And then it was after the Yom Kippur War. And there was a request for mitnadvim, for volunteers, and I volunteered to go to Israel. And I went to a non-religious kibbutz, and I loved it, and I loved the land, and I loved the people. And I began to read Jewish philosophy, and I began to read Jewish history. And I decided I wanted to become observant. And I heard that there was an Ulpan Megiyur, a special Ulpan for conversion, in Kratzion. I started to keep Shabbat, and I started to pray every day. And I was given a date to go to the mikveh to conclude my conversion. And I felt that I'd better go back to my home and to tell my parents personally. I had written to them that I wanted to live in Israel, but I hadn't the guts to write to them that I wanted to convert to Judaism. Took the plane. The first evening I was back. I announced to my parents after dinner that I wanted to become Jewish. My mother fainted straight away. When my father brought her to him, she came to herself. She said to me, you don't have to convert. You don't have to convert. You're Jewish because I'm Jewish. But when my parents were killed before my eyes in the European shtetl where I was born, and I was thrown into a cattle car to go to Theresienstadt, to the concentration camp, I took a vow that if I would ever get out of this hellhole alive, one Holocaust occurred, another is far more likely to occur. I want to at least save my grandchildren or great-grandchildren. I will never identify as Jewish again. There's no problem for me. I had no living relatives when I got out of Theresienstadt. So I began to live as a Christian, and I met your father, and we were married, and he's the only living person until now who knows of my Jewish background. But my son, if you want to rejoin the religion of my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, may the God in whom I cannot believe keep you our generation, I think there are two logical positions to take. Either the position of the young man's mother, which is logical, but I believe wrong to Jewish history and Jewish Bible, or the position of the young man. Post-Holocaust, the question is not belief in God, the question is belief in human nature. Either give up belief in human nature and give up Judaism, or affirm human nature.